Chapter 17 by Jad Baal-Lul. As Mosar carried Jane Clayton from the palace of Cayotan, the king, the woman struggled incessantly to regain her freedom. He tried to compel her to walk, but despite his threats and his abuse, she would not voluntarily take a single step in the direction in which he wished her to go. Instead, she threw herself to the ground each time he sought to place her upon her feet, and so of necessity he was compelled to carry her, though at last he tied her hands and gagged her to save himself from further lacerations. For the beauty and slenderness of the woman belied her strength and courage. When he came at last to where his men had gathered, he was glad indeed to turn her over to a couple of stalwart warriors, but these too were forced to carry her, since Mosar's fear of the vengeance of Cayotan's retainers would brook no delays. And thus they came down out of the hills from which a lure is carved, to the meadows that skirt the lower end of Jad Ben-Lul, with Jane Clayton carried between two of Mosar's men. At the edge of the lake lay a fleet of strong canoes, hollowed from the trunks of trees, their bows and sterns carved in the semblance of grotesque beasts or birds and vividly colored by some master in that primitive school of art, which fortunately is not without its devotees today. Into the stern of one of these canoes the warriors tossed their captive at a sign from Mosar, who came and stood beside her as the warriors were finding their places in the canoes and selecting their paddles. "Come, beautiful one," he said, "let us be friends, and you shall not be harmed. You will find Mosar a kind master if you do his bidding." And thinking to make a good impression on her, he removed the gag from her mouth and the thongs from her wrists, knowing well that she could not escape, surrounded as she was by his warriors, and presently, when they were out on the lake, she would be as safely imprisoned as though he held her behind bars. And so the fleet moved off to the accompaniment of the gentle splashing of 100 paddles, to follow the windings of the rivers and lakes through which the waters of the valley of Jad Ben-Otto empty into the great morass to the south. The warriors, resting upon one knee, faced the bow, and in the last canoe Mosar, tiring of his fruitless attempts to win responses from his sullen captive, squatted in the bottom of the canoe with his back toward her and resting his head upon the gunwale sought sleep. Thus they moved in silence between the verdure-clad banks of the little river through which the waters of Jad Ben-Lul emptied, now in the moonlight, now in dense shadow where great trees overhung the stream, and at last out upon the waters of another lake, the black shores of which seemed far away under the weird influence of a moonlight night. Jane Clayton sat alert in the stern of the last canoe. For months she had been under constant surveillance, the prisoner first of one ruthless race, and now the prisoner of another. Since the long-gone day that Hauptmann Fritz Schneider and his band of native German troops had treacherously wrought the Kaiser's work of rapine and destruction on the Greystoke bungalow and carried her away to captivity, she had not drawn a free breath. That she had survived unharmed the countless dangers through which she had passed she attributed solely to the beneficence of a kind and watchful providence. At first she had been held on the orders of the German High Command with a view of her ultimate value as a hostage, and during these months she had been subjected to neither hardship nor oppression. But when the Germans had become hard-pressed toward the close of their unsuccessful campaign in East Africa, it had been determined to take her further into the interior, and now there was an element of revenge in their motives, since it must have been apparent that she could no longer be of any possible military value. Bitter indeed were the Germans against that half-savage mate of hers who had cunningly annoyed and harassed them with a fiendishness of persistence and ingenuity that had resulted in a noticeable loss in morale in the sector he had chosen for his operations. They had to charge against him the lives of certain officers that he had deliberately taken with his own hands, and one entire section of trench that had made possible a disastrous turning movement by the British. Tarzan had out-generaled them at every point. He had met cunning with cunning and cruelty with cruelties until they feared and loathed his very name. The cunning trick that they had played upon him in destroying his home, murdering his retainers, and covering the abduction of his wife in such a way as to lead him to believe that she had been killed, they had regretted 1,000 times. For 1,000-fold had they paid the price for their senseless ruthlessness, and now, unable to wreak their vengeance directly upon him, they had conceived the idea of inflicting further suffering upon his mate. In sending her into the interior to avoid the path of the victorious British, they had chosen as her escort Lieutenant Erich Obergatz, who had been second in command of Schneider's company, and who alone of its officers had escaped the consuming vengeance of the ape-man. For a long time Obergatz had held her in a native village, the chief of which was still under the domination of his fear of the ruthless German oppressors. While here only hardships and discomforts assailed her, Obergatz himself being held in leash by the orders of his distant superior, but as time went on the life in the village grew to be a veritable hell of cruelties and oppressions practiced by the arrogant Prussian upon the villagers, and the members of his native command for time hung heavily upon the hands of the lieutenant, and with idleness combining with the personal discomforts he was compelled to endure, his none too agreeable temper found an outlet first in petty interference with the chiefs and later in the practice of absolute cruelties upon them. What the self-sufficient German could not see was plain to Jane Clayton, that the sympathies of Obergatz's native soldiers lay with the villagers, and that all were so heartily sickened by his abuse that it needed now but the slightest spark to detonate the mine of revenge and hatred that the pig-headed Hun had been assiduously fabricating beneath his own person. And at last it came, but from an unexpected source, in the form of a German native deserter from the theatre of war. Footsore, weary, and spent, he dragged himself into the village late one afternoon, and before Obergatz was even aware of his presence, the whole village knew that the power of Germany in Africa was at an end. It did not take long for the lieutenant's native soldiers to realize that the authority that held them in service no longer existed, and that with it had gone the power to pay them their miserable wage. Or at least, so they reasoned. To them Obergatz no longer represented aught else than a powerless and hated foreigner, and short indeed would have been his shrift had not a native woman who had conceived a dog-like affection for Jane Clayton hurried to her with word of the murderous plan. For the fate of the innocent white woman lay in the balance beside that of the guilty Teuton. Already they are quarreling as to which one shall possess you, she told Jane. When will they come for us? Asked Jane. Did you hear them say? Tonight, replied the woman, for even now that he has none to fight for him, they still fear the white man, and so they will come at night and kill him while he sleeps. Jane thanked the woman and sent her away, lest the suspicion of her fellows be aroused against her when they discovered that the two whites had learned of their intentions. The woman went at once to the hut occupied by Obergatz. She had never gone there before, and the German looked up in surprise as he saw who his visitor was. Briefly she told him what she had heard. At first he was inclined to bluster arrogantly with a great display of bravado, but she silenced him peremptorily. Such talk is useless, she said shortly. You have brought upon yourself the just hatred of these people, regardless of the truth or falsity of the report which has been brought to them. They believe in it, and there is nothing now between you and your maker other than flight. We shall both be dead before morning if we are unable to escape from the village unseen. If you go to them now with your silly protestations of authority, you will be dead a little sooner, that is all. You think it is as bad as that, he said, a noticeable alteration in his tone and manner. It is precisely as I have told you, she replied. They will come tonight and kill you while you sleep. Find me pistols and a rifle and ammunition, and we will pretend that we go into the jungle to hunt. That you have done often. Perhaps it will arouse suspicion that I accompany you, but that we must chance. And be sure, my dear Herr Lieutenant, to bluster and curse and abuse your servants unless they note a change in your manner, and realizing your fear, know that you suspect their intention. If all goes well, then we can go out into the jungle to hunt, and we need not return. But first and now you must swear never to harm me, or otherwise it would be better that I called the chief and turned you over to him and then put a bullet into my own head. For unless you swear as I have asked, I were no better alone in the jungle with you than here at the mercies of these degraded blacks. I swear, he replied solemnly, in the names of my God and my Kaiser, that no harm shall befall you at my hands, Lady Greystoke. Very well, she said, we will make this pact to assist each other to return to civilization, but let it be understood that there is and never can be any semblance even of respect for you upon my part. I am drowning and you are the straw. Carry that always in your mind, German. If Obergatz had held any doubt as to the sincerity of her word, it would have been wholly dissipated by the scathing contempt of her tone. And so Obergatz, without further parley, got pistols and an extra rifle for Jane, as well as bandoliers of cartridges. In his usual arrogant and disagreeable manner, he called his servants, telling them that he and the white Kali were going out into the brush to hunt. The beaters would go north as far as the little hill, and then circle back to the east and in toward the village. The gun carriers he directed to take the extra pieces and precede himself and Jane slowly toward the east, waiting for them at the ford about half a mile distant. The blacks responded with greater alacrity than usual, and it was noticeable to both Jane and Obergatz that they left the village whispering and laughing. The swine think it is a great joke, growled Obergatz, that the afternoon before I die I go out and hunt meat for them. As soon as the gun-bearers disappeared in the jungle beyond the village, the two Europeans followed along the same trail, nor was there any attempt upon the part of Obergat's native soldiers, or the warriors of the chief to detain them. For they too doubtless were more than willing that the whites should bring them in one more mess of meat before they killed them. A quarter of a mile from the village, Obergatz turned toward the south from the trail that led to the ford, and hurrying onward, the two put as great a distance as possible between them and the village before night fell. They knew from the habits of their erstwhile hosts that there was little danger of pursuit by night, since the villagers held Numa, the lion, in too great respect to venture needlessly beyond their stockade during the hours that the king of beasts was prone to choose for hunting. And thus began a seemingly endless sequence of frightful days and horror-laden nights as the two fought their way toward the south in the face of almost inconceivable hardships, privations, and dangers. The east coast was nearer, but Obergatz positively refused to chance throwing himself into the hands of the British by returning to the territory which they now controlled, insisting instead upon attempting to make his way through an unknown wilderness to South Africa, where, among the Boers, he was convinced he would find willing sympathizers who would find some way to return him in safety to Germany, and the woman was perforce compelled to accompany him. And so they had crossed the great thorny, waterless steppe and come at last to the edge of the morass before Palul dawn. They had reached this point just before the rainy season, when the waters of the morass were at their lowest ebb. At this time a hard crust is baked upon the dried surface of the marsh, and there is only the open water at the center to materially impede progress. It is a condition that exists perhaps not more than a few weeks, or even days at the termination of long periods of drought, and so the two crossed the otherwise almost impassable barrier without realizing its latent terrors. Even the open water in the center chanced to be deserted at the time by its frightful denizens, which the drought and the receding waters had driven southward toward the mouth of Paluldon's largest river, which carries the waters out of the valley of Jad Ben Otho. Their wanderings carried them across the mountains and into the valley of Jad Ben Otho at the source of one of the larger streams which bears the mountain waters down into the valley to empty them into the main river, just below the great lake on whose northern shore lies Allur. As they had come down out of the mountains, they had been surprised by a party of Hodon hunters. Obergatz had escaped while Jane had been taken prisoner and brought to Allur. She had neither seen nor heard aught of the German since that time, and she did not know whether he had perished in this strange land or succeeded in successfully eluding its savage denizens and making his way at last into South Africa. For her part, she had been incarcerated alternately in the palace and the temple, as either Keo Tan or Ludon succeeded in wresting her temporarily from the other by various strokes of cunning and intrigue. And now at last she was in the power of a new captor, one whom she knew from the gossip of the temple and the palace to be cruel and degraded. And she was in the stern of the last canoe, and every enemy back was toward her, while almost at her feet Mosar's loud snores gave ample evidence of his unconsciousness to his immediate surroundings. The dark shore loomed closer to the south as Jane Clayton, Lady Greystoke, slid quietly over the stern of the canoe into the chill waters of the lake. She scarcely moved other than to keep her nostrils above the surface while the canoe was yet discernible in the last rays of the declining moon. Then she struck out toward the southern shore. Alone, unarmed, all but naked, in a country overrun by savage beasts and hostile men, she yet felt for the first time in many months a sensation of elation and relief. She was free. What if the next moment brought death? She knew again, at least a brief instant of absolute freedom. Her blood tingled to the almost forgotten sensation, and it was with difficulty that she restrained a glad, triumphant cry as she clambered from the quiet waters and stood upon the silent beach. Before her loomed a forest, darkly, and from its depths came those nameless sounds that are a part of the night life of the jungle: the rustling of leaves in the wind, the rubbing together of contiguous branches, the scurrying of a rodent. All magnified by the darkness to sinister and awe-inspiring proportions. The hoot of an owl, the distant scream of a great cat, the barking of wild dogs, attested the presence of the myriad life she could not see, the savage life, the free life of which she was now a part. And then there came to her, possibly for the first time since the giant ape-man had come into her life, a fuller realization of what the jungle meant to him. For though alone and unprotected from its hideous dangers, she yet felt its lure upon her, and an exaltation that she had not dared hope to feel again. Ah, if that mighty mate of hers were but by her side, what utter joy and bliss would be hers! She longed for no more than this. The parade of cities, the comforts and luxuries of civilization held forth no allure half as insistent as the glorious freedom of the jungle. A lion moaned in the blackness to her right, eliciting delicious thrills that crept along her spine. The hair at the back of her head seemed to stand erect, yet she was unafraid. The muscles bequeathed her by some primordial ancestor reacted instinctively to the presence of an ancient enemy, that was all. The woman moved slowly and deliberately toward the wood. Again the lion moaned, this time nearer. She sought a low-hanging branch and finding it swung easily into the friendly shelter of the tree. The long and perilous journey with Obergatz had trained her muscles and her nerves to such unaccustomed habits. She found a safe resting place such as Tarzan had taught her was best, and there she curled herself 30 feet above the ground for a night's rest. She was cold and uncomfortable, and yet she slept, for her heart was warm with renewed hope, and her tired brain had found temporary surcease from worry. She slept until the heat of the sun, high in the heavens, awakened her. She was rested, and now her body as well as her heart was warm. A sensation of ease and comfort and happiness pervaded her being. She rose upon her gently swaying couch and stretched luxuriously, her naked limbs and lithe body mottled by the sunlight filtering through the foliage above, combined with the lazy gesture to impart to her appearance something of the leopard. With careful eye she scrutinized the ground below, and with attentive ear she listened for any warning sound that might suggest the near presence of enemies, either man or beast. Satisfied at last that there was nothing close of which she need have fear, she clambered to the ground. She wished to bathe, but the lake was too exposed and just a bit too far from the safety of the trees for her to risk it until she became more familiar with her surroundings. She wandered aimlessly through the forest searching for food, which she found in abundance. She ate and rested, for she had no objective as yet. Her freedom was too new to be spoiled by plannings for the future. The haunts of civilized man seemed to her now as vague and unattainable as the half-forgotten substance of a dream. If she could but live on here in peace, waiting for him. It was the old hope revived. She knew that he would come someday, if he lived. She had always known that, though recently she had believed that he would come too late, if he lived. Yes, he would come if he lived, and if he did not live she were as well off here as elsewhere, for then nothing mattered, only to wait for the end as patiently as might be. Her wanderings brought her to a crystal brook, and there she drank and bathed beneath an overhanging tree that offered her quick asylum in the event of danger. It was a quiet and beautiful spot, and she loved it from the first. The bottom of the brook was paved with pretty stones and bits of glassy obsidian. As she gathered a handful of the pebbles and held them up to look at them, she noticed that one of her fingers was bleeding from a clean, straight cut. She fell to searching for the cause and presently discovered it in one of the fragments of volcanic glass, which revealed an edge that was almost razor-like. Jane Clayton was elated. Here, God-given to her hands, was the first beginning with which she might eventually arrive at both weapons and tools at cutting edge. Everything was possible to him who possessed it, nothing without. She sought until she had collected many of the precious bits of stone until the pouch that hung at her right side was almost filled. Then she climbed into the great tree to examine them at leisure. There were some that looked like knife blades and some that could easily be fashioned into spearheads, and many smaller ones that nature seemed to have intended for the tips of savage arrows. The spear she would essay first, that would be easiest. There was a hollow in the bole of the tree, in a great crotch high above the ground. Here she cached all of her treasure, except a single knife-like sliver. With this she descended to the ground, and searching out a slender sapling that grew arrow straight, she hacked and sawed until she could break it off without splitting the wood. It was just the right diameter for the shaft of a spear, a hunting spear, such as her beloved Waziri had liked best. How often had she watched them fashioning them, and they had taught her how to use them and the heavy war spears, laughing and clapping their hands as her proficiency increased. She knew the arborescent grasses that yielded the longest and toughest fibers, and these she sought and carried to her tree with the spear shaft that was to be. Clambering to her crotch, she bent to her work, humming softly a little tune. She caught herself and smiled. It was the first time in all these bitter months that song had passed her lips, or such a smile. I feel, she sighed, I almost feel that John is near, my John, my Tarzan. She cut the spear shaft to the proper length and removed the twigs and branches and the bark, whittling and scraping at the nubs until the surface was all smooth and straight. Then she split one end and inserted a spear point, shaping the wood until it fitted perfectly. This done, she laid the shaft aside and fell to splitting the thick grass stems and pounding and twisting them until she had separated and partially cleaned the fibers. These she took down to the brook and washed and brought back again and wound tightly around the cleft end of the shaft, which she had notched to receive them, and the upper part of the spearhead, which she had also notched slightly with a bit of stone. It was a crude spear, but the best that she could attain in so short a time. Later she promised herself she should have others, many of them, and they would be spears of which even the greatest of the Waziri spearmen might be proud. Chapter 18. The Lion Pit of Tulur. Though Tarzan searched the outskirts of the city until nearly dawn, he discovered nowhere the spoor of his mate. The breeze coming down from the mountains brought to his nostrils a diversity of scents, but there was not among them the slightest suggestion of her whom he sought. The natural deduction was therefore that she had been taken in some other direction. In his search he had many times crossed the fresh tracks of many men leading toward the lake, and these he concluded had probably been made by Jane Clayton's abductors. It had only been to minimize the chance of error by the process of elimination that he had carefully reconnoitered every other avenue leading from Allur toward the southeast, where lay Mosar's city of Tulur. And now he followed the trail to the shores of Jad Ben Lul, where the party had embarked upon the quiet waters in their sturdy canoes. He found many other craft of the same description moored along the shore, and one of these he commandeered for the purpose of pursuit. It was daylight when he passed through the lake which lies next below Jad Ben Lul, and paddling strongly passed within sight of the very tree in which his lost mate lay sleeping. Had the gentle wind that caressed the bosom of the lake been blowing from a southerly direction, the giant ape-man and Jane Clayton would have been reunited then. But an unkind fate had willed otherwise, and the opportunity passed with the passing of his canoe, which presently his powerful strokes carried out of sight into the stream at the lower end of the lake. Following the winding river, which bore a considerable distance to the north before doubling back to empty into the Jad in Lul, the ape-man missed a portage that would have saved him hours of paddling. It was at the upper end of this portage, where Mosar and his warriors had debarked, that the chief discovered the absence of his captive. As Mosar had been asleep since shortly after their departure from Allur, and as none of the warriors recalled when she had last been seen, it was impossible to conjecture with any degree of accuracy the place where she had escaped. The consensus of opinion was, however, that it had been in the narrow river connecting Jad Ben Lul with the lake next below it, which is called Jad Bal Lul, which freely translated means the Lake of Gold. Mosar had been very wroth, and having himself been the only one at fault, he naturally sought with great diligence to fix the blame upon another. He would have returned in search of her, had he not feared to meet a pursuing company dispatched either by Jadon or the high priest, both of whom he knew had just grievances against him. He would not even spare a boatload of his warriors from his own protection to return in quest of the fugitive, but hastened onward with as little delay as possible across the portage and out upon the waters of Jad in Lul. The morning sun was just touching the white domes of Tulur when Mosar's paddlers brought their canoes against the shore at the city's edge. Safe once more behind his own walls and protected by many warriors, the courage of the chief returned sufficiently at least to permit him to dispatch 3 canoes in search of Jane Clayton, and also to go as far as Allur if possible to learn what had delayed Bulot, whose failure to reach the canoes with the balance of the party at the time of the flight from the northern city had in no way delayed Mosar's departure, his own safety being of far greater moment than that of his son. As the 3 canoes reached the portage on their return journey, the warriors who were dragging them from the water were suddenly startled by the appearance of 2 priests, carrying a light canoe in the direction of Jad and Lul. At first they thought them the advance guard of a larger force of Ludon's followers, although the correctness of such a theory was belied by their knowledge that priests never accepted the risks or perils of a warrior's vocation, nor even fought until driven into a corner and forced to do so. Secretly the warriors of Pal Uldon held the emasculated priesthood in contempt, and so instead of immediately taking up the offensive as they would have had the 2 men been warriors from Allur instead of priests, they waited to question them. At sight of the warriors, the priests made the sign of peace, and upon being asked if they were alone, they answered in the affirmative. The leader of Mosar's warriors permitted them to approach. "What do you here," he asked, "in the country of Mosar, so far from your own city?" "We carry a message from Ludon, the high priest," to Mosar explained one. "Is it a message of peace or of war?" asked the warrior. "It is an offer of peace," replied the priest. "And Ludon is sending no warriors behind you?" queried the fighting man. "We are alone," the priest assured him. "None in Allur save Ludon knows that we have come upon this errand." "Then go your way," said the warrior. "Who is that?" asked one of the priests suddenly, pointing toward the upper end of the lake at the point where the river from Jad Bal Lul entered it. All eyes turned in the direction that he had indicated to see a lone warrior paddling rapidly into Jad in Lul, the prow of his canoe pointing toward Tulur. The warriors and the priests drew into the concealment of the bushes on either side of the portage. "It is the terrible man who called himself the Doro Ulto," whispered one of the priests. "I would know that figure among a great multitude as far as I could see it." "You are right, priest," cried one of the warriors who had seen Tarzan the day that he had first entered Khaitan's palace. "It is indeed he who has been rightly called Tarzan Jadguru." "Hasten, priests," cried the leader of the party. "You are 2 paddles in a light canoe. Easily can you reach Tulur ahead of him and warn Mosar of his coming, for he has but only entered the lake." For a moment the priests demurred, for they had no stomach for an encounter with this terrible man, but the warrior insisted and even went so far as to threaten them. Their canoe was taken from them and pushed into the lake, and they were all but lifted bodily from their feet and put aboard it. Still protesting, they were shoved out upon the water, where they were immediately in full view of the lone paddler above them. Now there was no alternative. The city of Tulur offered the only safety, and bending to their paddles, the 2 priests sent their craft swiftly in the direction of the city. The warriors withdrew again to the concealment of the foliage. If Tarzan had seen them and should come hither to investigate, there were 30 of them against 1, and naturally they had no fear of the outcome. But they did not consider it necessary to go out upon the lake to meet him, since they had been sent to look for the escaped prisoner and not to intercept the strange warrior. The stories of whose ferocity and prowess doubtless helped them to arrive at their decision to provoke no uncalled for quarrel with him. If he had seen them, he gave no sign, but continued paddling steadily and strongly toward the city, nor did he increase his speed as the 2 priests shot out in full view. The moment the priest's canoe touched the shore by the city, its occupants leapt out and hurried swiftly toward the palace gate, casting affrighted glances behind them. They sought immediate audience with Mosar, after warning the warriors on guard that Tarzan was approaching. They were conducted at once to the chief, whose court was a smaller replica of that of the king of Allur. "We come from Ludon," the high priest explained, the spokesman. "He wishes the friendship of Mosar, who has always been his friend. Jadon is gathering warriors to make himself king. Throughout the villages of the Hodon are thousands who will obey the commands of Ludon, the high priest. Only with Ludon's assistance can Mosar become king. And the message from Ludon is that if Mosar would retain the friendship of Ludon, he must return immediately the woman he took from the quarters of the Princess Oloe." At this juncture a warrior entered. His excitement was evident. "The Dor Uoto has come to Tulur and demands to see Mosar at once," he said. "The Dor Uoto," exclaimed Mosar. "That is the message he sent," replied the warrior, "and indeed he is not as are the people of Palol Don. He is, we think, the same of whom the warriors that returned from Allur today told us, and whom some call Tarzan Jadguru and some Dor Ulotho, but indeed only the Son of God would dare come thus alone to a strange city. So it must be that he speaks the truth." Mosar, his heart filled with terror and indecision, turned questioningly toward the priests. "Receive him graciously," Mosar counseled, he who had spoken before, his advice prompted by the petty shrewdness of his defective brain, which, under the added influence of Ludon's tutorage, leaned always toward duplicity. "Receive him graciously, and when he is quite convinced of your friendship, he will be off his guard, and then you may do with him as you will. But if possible, Mosar, and you would win the undying gratitude of Ludon, the high priest, save him alive for my master." Mosar nodded understandingly, and turning to the warrior commanded that he conduct the visitor to him. "We must not be seen by the creature," said one of the priests. "Give us your answer to Ludon, Mosar, and we will go our way." "Tell Ludon," replied the chief, "that the woman would have been lost to him entirely had it not been for me. I sought to bring her to Tulur that I might save her for him from the clutches of Jadon. But during the night she escaped. Tell Ludon that I have sent 30 warriors to search for her. It is strange you did not see them as you came." "We did," replied the priests, "but they told us nothing of the purpose of their journey." "It is as I have told you," said Mosar, "and if they find her, assure your master that she will be kept unharmed in Tulur for him. Also tell him that I will send my warriors to join with his against Jadon whenever he sends word that he wants them. Now go, for Tarzan Jadguru will soon be here." He signaled to a slave. "Lead the priests to the temple," he commanded, "and ask the high priest of Tulur to see that they are fed and permitted to return to Allur when they will." The 2 priests were conducted from the apartment by the slave through a doorway other than that at which they had entered, and a moment later Tarzan Jadguru strode into the presence of Mosar. ahead of the warrior whose duty it had been to conduct and announce him. The ape-man made no sign of greeting or of peace, but strode directly toward the chief who, only by the exertion of his utmost powers of will, hid the terror that was in his heart at sight of the giant figure and the scowling face. "I am the Doro Oloto," said the ape-man in level tones that carried to the mind of Mosar a suggestion of cold steel. "I am Doro Oloto, and I come to Tulur for the woman you stole from the apartments of Oloae, the princess." The very boldness of Tarzan's entry into this hostile city had had the effect of giving him a great moral advantage over Mosar and the savage warriors who stood upon either side of the chief. Truly it seemed to them that no other than the son of Jad Ben Otho would dare so heroic an act. Would any mortal warrior act thus boldly, and alone enter the presence of a powerful chief, and in the midst of a score of warriors arrogantly demand an accounting? No, it was beyond reason. Mosar was faltering in his decision to betray the stranger by seeming friendliness. He even paled to a sudden thought. Jad Ben Otho knew everything, even our inmost thoughts. Was it not therefore possible that this creature, if after all it should prove true that he was the Doro Oloto, might even now be reading the wicked design that the priests had implanted in the brain of Mosar, and which he had entertained so favorably? The chief squirmed and fidgeted upon the bench of hewn rock that was his throne. "Quick," snapped the ape-man, "where is she?" "She is not here," cried Mosar. "You lie," replied Tarzan. "As Jad Ben Otho is my witness, she is not in Tulur," insisted the chief. "You may search the palace and the temple and the entire city, but you will not find her, for she is not here." "Where is she then?" demanded the ape-man. "You took her from the palace at Allur. If she is not here, where is she? Tell me not that harm has befallen her." And he took a sudden threatening step toward Mosar that sent the chief shrinking back in terror. "Wait," he cried. "If you are indeed the Doro Oloto, you will know that I speak the truth. I took her from the palace of Keotan to save her for Ludon, the high priest, lest with Keotan dead Jadon seize her. But during the night she escaped from me between here and Allur. And I have but just sent 3 canoes full manned in search of her." Something in the chief's tone and manner assured the ape-man that he spoke in part the truth, and that once again he had braved incalculable dangers and suffered loss of time futilely. "What wanted the priests of Ludon that preceded me here?" demanded Tarzan, chancing a shrewd guess that the 2 he had seen paddling so frantically to avoid a meeting with him had indeed come from the high priest at Allur. "They came upon an errand similar to yours," replied Mosar, "to demand the return of the woman whom Ludon thought I had stolen from him, thus wronging me as deeply, O Doro Oloto, as have you." "I would question the priests," said Tarzan. "Bring them hither." His peremptory and arrogant manner left Mosar in doubt as to whether to be more incensed or terrified, but ever as is the way with such as he concluded that the first consideration was his own safety. If he could transfer the attention and the wrath of this terrible man from himself to Ludon's priests, it would more than satisfy him, and if they should conspire to harm him, then Mosar would be safe in the eyes of Jad Ben Otho. If it finally developed that the stranger was in reality the son of God, he felt uncomfortable in Tarzan's presence, and this fact rather accentuated his doubt, for thus indeed would mortal feel in the presence of a god. Now he saw a way to escape, at least temporarily. "I will fetch them myself, Doro Otho," he said, and turning left the apartment. His hurried steps brought him quickly to the temple, for the palace grounds of Tulur, which also included the temple as in all of the Hodon cities, covered a much smaller area than those of the larger city of Allur. He found Ludon's messengers with the high priest of his own temple, and quickly transmitted to them the commands of the ape-man. "What do you intend to do with him?" asked one of the priests. "I have no quarrel with him," replied Mosar. "He came in peace, and he may depart in peace, for who knows but that he is indeed the Doro Oloto?" "We know that he is not," replied Ludon's emissary. "We have every proof that he is only mortal, a strange creature from another country. Already has Ludon offered his life to Jad Ben Otho, if he is wrong in his belief that this creature is not the son of God. If the high priest of Allur, who is the highest priest of all the high priests of Palal-Ildon, is thus so sure that the creature is an impostor as to stake his life upon his judgment, then who are we to give credence to the claims of this stranger? No, Mosar. You need not fear him. He is only a warrior who may be overcome with the same weapons that subdue your own fighting men. Were it not for Ludon's command that he be taken alive, I would urge you to set your warriors upon him and slay him. But the commands of Ludon are the commands of Jad Ben Otho himself, and those we may not disobey." But still the remnant of a doubt stirred within the cowardly breast of Mo Sar, urging him to let another take the initiative against the stranger. "He is yours then," he replied, "to do with as you will. I have no quarrel with him. What you may command shall be the command of Loudon, the high priest, and further than that I shall have nothing to do in the matter." The priests turned to him who guided the destinies of the temple at Tulur. "Have you no plan?" they asked. "High indeed will he stand in the councils of Loudon, and in the eyes of Jad Ben Otho, who finds the means to capture this impostor alive." "There is the lion pit," whispered the high priest. "It is now vacant, and what will hold Ja and Jato will hold this stranger if he is not the Doro Lotho." "It will hold him," said Mosar, "doubtless too. It would hold a gref, but first you would have to get the gref into it." The priests pondered this bit of wisdom thoughtfully, and then one of those from Allur spoke. "It should not be difficult." He said, "If we use the wits that Jad Ben Otho gave us instead of the worldly muscles which were handed down to us from our fathers and our mothers, and which have not even the power possessed by those of the beasts that run about on 4 feet. Loudon matched his wits with the stranger and Los suggested Mosar, "But this is your own affair. Carry it out as you see best." At Allur, Ko Tan made much of this Doro Lotho, and the priests conducted him through the temple. It would arouse in his mind no suspicion were you to do the same. And let the high priest of Tulur invite him to the temple, and gathering all the priests make a great show of belief in his kinship to Jad Ben Otho. And what more natural then than that the high priest should wish to show him through the temple, as did Loudon at Allur when Khotan commanded it. And if by chance he should be led through the lion pit, it would be a simple matter for those who bear the torches to extinguish them suddenly, and before the stranger was aware of what had happened, the stone gates could be dropped, thus safely securing him. "But there are windows in the pit that let in light," interposed the high priest, "and even though the torches were extinguished he could still see and might escape before the stone door could be lowered." "Send one who will cover the windows tightly with hides," said the priest from Allur. "The plan is a good one," said Mosar, seeing an opportunity for entirely eliminating himself from any suspicion of complicity, for it will require the presence of no warriors, and thus with only priests about him his mind will entertain no suspicion of harm. They were interrupted at this point by a messenger from the palace who brought word that the Doro Lotho was becoming impatient, and if the priests from Allur were not brought to him at once he would come himself to the temple and get them. Mosar shook his head. He could not conceive of such brazen courage in mortal breast, and glad he was that the plan evolved for Tarzan's undoing did not necessitate his active participation. And so while Mosar left for a secret corner of the palace by a roundabout way, 3 priests were dispatched to Tarzan, and with whining words that did not entirely deceive him. They acknowledged his kinship to Jad Ben Otho and begged him in the name of the high priest to honor the temple with a visit, when the priests from Allur would be brought to him and would answer any questions that he put to them. Confident that a continuation of his bravado would best serve his purpose, and also that if suspicion against him should crystallize into conviction on the part of Mosar and his followers, that he would be no worse off in the temple than in the palace. The ape-man haughtily accepted the invitation of the high priest. And so he came into the temple, and was received in a manner befitting his high claims. He questioned the 2 priests of Allur, from whom he obtained only a repetition of the story that Mosar had told him, and then the high priest invited him to inspect the temple. They took him first to the altar court, of which there was only one in Tulur. It was almost identical in every respect with those at Allur. There was a bloody altar at the east end and the drowning basin at the west, and the grisly fringes upon the headdresses of the priests attested the fact that the eastern altar was an active force in the rites of the temple. Through the chambers and corridors beneath they led him, and finally, with torch-bearers to light their steps, into a damp and gloomy labyrinth, at a low level, and here in a large chamber, the air of which was still heavy with the odor of lions. The crafty priests of Tulur encompassed their shrewd design. The torches were suddenly extinguished. There was a hurried confusion of bare feet moving rapidly across the stone floor. There was a loud crash, as of a heavy weight of stone falling upon stone, and then surrounding the ape-man naught but the darkness and the silence of the tomb. Chapter 19. Diana of the Jungle. Jane had made her first kill, and she was very proud of it. It was not a very formidable animal, only a hare, but it marked an epoch in her existence. Just as in the dim past the first hunter had shaped the destinies of mankind, so it seemed that this event might shape hers in some new mold. No longer was she dependent upon the wild fruits and vegetables for sustenance. Now she might command meat, the giver of the strength and endurance she would require successfully to cope with the necessities of her primitive existence. The next step was fire. She might learn to eat raw flesh, as had her lord and master, but she shrank from that. The thought even was repulsive. She had, however, a plan for fire. She had given the matter thought, but had been too busy to put it into execution so long as fire could be of no immediate use to her. Now it was different. She had something to cook, and her mouth watered for the flesh of her kill. She would grill it above glowing embers. Jane hastened to her tree. Among the treasures she had gathered in the bed of the stream were several pieces of volcanic glass, clear as crystal. She sought until she had found the one in mind, which was convex. Then she hurried to the ground and gathered a little pile of powdered bark that was very dry, and some dead leaves and grasses that had lain long in the hot sun. Near at hand she arranged a supply of dead twigs and branches, small and large. Vibrant with suppressed excitement, she held the bit of glass above the tinder, moving it slowly until she had focused the sun's rays upon a tiny spot. She waited breathlessly. How slow it was! Were her high hopes to be dashed in spite of all her clever planning? No. A thin thread of smoke rose gracefully into the quiet air. Presently the tinder glowed and broke suddenly into flame. Jane clasped her hands beneath her chin with a little gurgling exclamation of delight. She had achieved fire. She piled on twigs and then larger branches, and at last dragged a small log to the flames and pushed an end of it into the fire, which was crackling merrily. It was the sweetest sound that she had heard for many a month. But she could not wait for the mass of embers that would be required to cook her hare. As quickly as might be, she skinned and cleaned her kill, burying the hide and entrails that she had learned from Tarzan. It served two purposes. One was the necessity for keeping a sanitary camp, and the other the obliteration of the scent that most quickly attracts the man-eaters. Then she ran a stick through the carcass and held it above the flames. By turning it often she prevented burning, and at the same time permitted the meat to cook thoroughly all the way through. When it was done, she scampered high into the safety of her tree to enjoy her meal in quiet and peace. Never thought Lady Greystoke had aught more delicious past her lips. She patted her spear affectionately. It had brought her this toothsome dainty, and with it a feeling of greater confidence and safety than she had enjoyed since that frightful day that she and Obergatz had spent their last cartridge. She would never forget that day. It had seemed one hideous succession of frightful beast after frightful beast. They had not been long in this strange country, yet they thought that they were hardened to dangers, for daily they had had encounters with ferocious creatures, but this day she shuddered when she thought of it. And with her last cartridge she had killed a black and yellow striped lion thing with great saber teeth, just as it was about to spring upon Obergatz, who had futilely emptied his rifle into it, the last shot, his final cartridge. For another day they had carried the now useless rifles, but at last they had discarded them and thrown away the cumbersome bandoliers as well. How they had managed to survive during the ensuing week she could never quite understand, and then the Hodon had come upon them and captured her. Obergatz had escaped. She was living it all over again. Doubtless he was dead, unless he had been able to reach this side of the valley, which was quite evidently less overrun with savage beasts. Jane's days were very full ones now, and the daylight hours seemed all too short in which to accomplish the many things she had determined upon. Since she had concluded that this spot presented as ideal a place as she could find to live until she could fashion the weapons she considered necessary for the obtaining of meat and for self-defense, she felt that she must have, in addition to a good spear, a knife, and bow and arrows. Possibly when these had been achieved, she might seriously consider an attempt to fight her way to one of civilization's nearest outposts. In the meantime, it was necessary to construct some sort of protective shelter in which she might feel a greater sense of security by night, for she knew that there was a possibility that any night she might receive a visit from a prowling panther. Although she had as yet seen none upon this side of the valley, aside from this danger she felt comparatively safe in her aerial retreat. The cutting of the long poles for her home occupied all of the daylight hours that were not engaged in the search for food. These poles she carried high into her tree, and with them constructed a flooring across two stout branches, binding the poles together, and also to the branches with fibers from the tough arboraceous grasses that grew in profusion near the stream. Similarly, she built walls and a roof, the latter thatched with many layers of great leaves. The fashioning of the barred windows and the door were matters of great importance and consuming interest. The windows, there were two of them, were large and the bars permanently fixed, but the door was small, the opening just large enough to permit her to pass through easily on hands and knees, which made it easier to barricade. She lost count of the days that the house cost her, but time was a cheap commodity. She had more of it than of anything else. It meant so little to her that she had not even any desire to keep account of it. How long since she and Obergatz had fled from the wrath of the Negro villagers she did not know, and she could only roughly guess at the seasons. She worked hard for two reasons. One was to hasten the completion of her little place of refuge, and the other a desire for such physical exhaustion at night that she would sleep through those dreaded hours to a new day. As a matter of fact, the house was finished in less than a week. That is, it was made as safe as it ever would be, though regardless of how long she might occupy it, she would keep on adding touches and refinements here and there. Her daily life was filled with her house building and her hunting, to which was added an occasional spice of excitement contributed by roving lions. To the woodcraft that she had learned from Tarzan, that master of the art, was added a considerable store of practical experience derived from her own past adventures in the jungle and the long months with Obergatz, nor was any day now lacking in some added store of useful knowledge. To these facts was attributable her apparent immunity from harm, since they told her when Ja was approaching before he crept close enough for a successful charge, and two, they kept her close to those never-failing heavens of retreat, the trees. The nights, filled with their weird noises, were lonely and depressing. Only her ability to sleep quickly and soundly made them endurable. The first night that she spent in her completed house behind barred windows and barricaded door was one of almost undiluted peace and happiness. The night noises seemed far removed and impersonal, and the soughing of the wind in the trees was gently soothing. Before, it had carried a mournful note and was sinister in that it might hide the approach of some real danger. That night she slept indeed. She went further afield now in search of food. So far nothing but rodents had fallen to her spear. Her ambition was an antelope, since beside the flesh it would give her and the gut for her bow, the hide would prove invaluable during the colder weather that she knew would accompany the rainy season. She had caught glimpses of these wary animals and was sure that they always crossed the stream at a certain spot above her camp. It was to this place that she went to hunt them. With the stealth and cunning of a panther, she crept through the forest, circling about to get upwind from the ford, pausing often to look and listen for aught that might menace her, herself the personification of a hunted deer. Now she moved silently down upon the chosen spot. What luck! A beautiful buck stood drinking in the stream. The woman wormed her way closer. Now she lay upon her belly behind a small bush within throwing distance of the quarry. She must rise to her full height and throw her spear almost in the same instant, and she must throw it with great force and perfect accuracy. She thrilled with the excitement of the minute, yet cool and steady were her swift muscles as she rose and cast her missile. Scarce by the width of a finger did the point strike from the spot at which it had been directed. The buck leaped high, landed upon the bank of the stream, and fell dead. Jane Clayton sprang quickly forward toward her kill. "Bravo," a man's voice spoke in English from the shrubbery upon the opposite side of the stream. Jane Clayton halted in her tracks, stunned, almost by surprise, and then a strange, unkempt figure of a man stepped into view. At first she did not recognize him, but when she did, instinctively she stepped back. "Lieutenant Obergatz," she cried, "can it be you?" "It can. It is," replied the German. "I am a strange sight, no doubt, but still it is I, Erich Obergatz. And you have changed too, is it not?" He was looking at her naked limbs and her golden breastplates, the loincloth of Jaito hide, the harness and ornaments that constitute the apparel of a Hodon woman, the things that Ludon had dressed her in as his passion for her grew. Not Caotan's daughter even had finer trappings. "But why are you here?" Jane insisted. "I had thought you safely among civilized men by this time, if you still lived." "God," he exclaimed. "I do not know why I continue to live. I have prayed to die, and yet I cling to life. There is no hope. We are doomed to remain in this horrible land until we die. The bog, the frightful bog. I have searched its shores for a place to cross, until I have entirely circled the hideous country, easily. Sure enough we entered, but the rains have come since, and now no living man could pass that slough of slimy mud and hungry reptiles. Have I not tried it? And the beasts that roam this accursed land, they hunt me by day and by night." "But how have you escaped them?" she asked. "I do not know," he replied gloomily. "I have fled and fled and fled. I have remained hungry and thirsty in treetops for days at a time. I have fashioned weapons, clubs and spears, and I have learned to use them. I have slain a lion with my club, so even will a cornered rat fight, and we are no better than rats in this land of stupendous dangers, you and I. But tell me about yourself. If it is surprising that I live, how much more so that you still survive?" Briefly she told him, and all the while she was wondering what she might do to rid herself of him. She could not conceive of a prolonged existence with him as her sole companion. Better, 1,000 times better, to be alone. Never had her hatred and contempt for him lessened through the long weeks and months of their constant companionship, and now that he could be of no service in returning her to civilization, she shrank from the thought of seeing him daily. And too, she feared him. Never had she trusted him, but now there was a strange light in his eye that had not been there when last she saw him. She could not interpret. All she knew was that it gave her a feeling of apprehension and nameless dread. "You lived long then in the city of Allure," he said, speaking in the language of Palul Dawn. "You have learned this tongue?" she asked. "How?" "I fell in with a band of half-breeds," he replied, "members of a proscribed race that dwells in the rock-bound gut through which the principal river of the valley empties into the morass. They are called Waz-Hodan, and their village is partly made up of cave dwellings and partly of houses carved from the soft rock at the foot of the cliff. They are very ignorant and superstitious, and when they first saw me and realized that I had no tail and that my hands and feet were not like theirs, they were afraid of me. They thought that I was either god or demon. Being in a position where I could neither escape them nor defend myself, I made a bold front and succeeded in impressing them to such an extent that they conducted me to their city, which they call Bulur, and there they fed me and treated me with kindness. As I learned their language, I sought to impress them more and more with the idea that I was a god, and I succeeded too, until an old fellow who was something of a priest among them, or medicine man, became jealous of my growing power. That was the beginning of the end, and came near to being the end in fact. He told them that if I was a god, I would not bleed if a knife was stuck into me. If I did bleed, it would prove conclusively that I was not a god. Without my knowledge, he arranged to stage the ordeal before the whole village upon a certain night. It was upon one of those numerous occasions when they eat and drink to Jad Ben Otho, their pagan deity. Under the influence of their vile liquor, they would be ripe for any bloodthirsty scheme the medicine man might evolve. One of the women told me about the plan, not with any intent to warn me of danger, but prompted merely by feminine curiosity as to whether or not I would bleed if stuck with a dagger. She could not wait, it seemed, for the orderly procedure of the ordeal. She wanted to know at once, and when I caught her trying to slip a knife into my side and questioned her, she explained the whole thing with the utmost naivety. The warriors already had commenced drinking. It would have been futile to make any sort of appeal either to their intellects or their superstitions. There was but one alternative to death, and that was flight. I told the woman that I was very much outraged and offended at this reflection upon my godhood, and that, as a mark of my disfavor, I should abandon them to their fate. "I shall return to heaven at once," I exclaimed. She wanted to hang around and see me go. But I told her that her eyes would be blasted by the fire surrounding my departure, and that she must leave at once and not return to the spot for at least an hour. I also impressed upon her the fact that should any other approach this part of the village within that time, not only they, but she as well, would burst into flames and be consumed. She was very much impressed and lost no time in leaving, calling back as she departed that if I were indeed gone in an hour, she and all the village would know that I was no less than Jad Ben Otho himself, and so they must think me, for I can assure you that I was gone in much less than an hour. Nor have I ventured close to the neighborhood of the city of Bulur since, and he fell to laughing in harsh, cackling notes that sent a shiver through the woman's frame. As Obergatz talked, Jane had recovered her spear from the carcass of the antelope and commenced busying herself with the removal of the hide. The man made no attempt to assist her, but stood by talking and watching her, the while he continually ran his filthy fingers through his matted hair and beard. His face and body were caked with dirt, and he was naked except for a torn greasy hide about his loins. His weapons consisted of a club and knife of Wazdon pattern, that he had stolen from the city of Bulur, but what more greatly concerned the woman than his filth or his armament were his cackling laughter and the strange expression in his eyes. She went on with her work, however, removing those parts of the buck she wanted, taking only as much meat as she might consume before it spoiled, as she was not sufficiently a true jungle creature to relish it beyond that stage, and then she straightened up and faced the man. "Lieutenant Obergatz," she said, "by a chance of accident we have met again. Certainly you would not have sought the meeting any more than I. We have nothing in common other than those sentiments which may have been engendered by my natural dislike and suspicion of you. one of the authors of all the misery and sorrow that I have endured for endless months. This little corner of the world is mine by right of discovery and occupation. Go away and leave me to enjoy here what peace I may. It is the least that you can do to amend the wrong that you have done me, and mine." The man stared at her through his fishy eyes for a moment in silence. Then there broke from his lips a peal of mirthless, uncanny laughter. "Go away. Leave you alone," he cried. "I have found you. We are going to be good friends. There is no one else in the world but us. No one will ever know what we do or what becomes of us, and now you ask me to go away and live alone in this hellish solitude." Again he laughed, though neither the muscles of his eyes or his mouth reflected any mirth. It was just a hollow sound that imitated laughter. "Remember your promise," she said. "Promise, promise. What are promises? They are made to be broken. We taught the world that at Liege and Louvain. No, I will not go away. I shall stay and protect you." "I do not need your protection," she insisted. "You have already seen that I can use a spear." "Yes," he said, "but it would not be right to leave you here alone. You are but a woman." No, I am an officer of the Kaiser, and I cannot abandon you." Once more he laughed. "We could be very happy here together," he added. The woman could not repress a shudder, nor in fact did she attempt to hide her aversion. "You do not like me?" he asked. "Ah, well, it is too sad. But some day you will love me," and again the hideous laughter. The woman had wrapped the pieces of the buck in the hide, and this she now raised and threw across her shoulder. In her other hand she held her spear and faced the German. "Go," she commanded. "We have wasted enough words. This is my country and I shall defend it. If I see you about again, I shall kill you. Do you understand?" An expression of rage contorted Obergat's features. He raised his club and started toward her. "Stop," she commanded, throwing her spear hand backward for a cast. "You saw me kill this buck, and you have said truthfully that no one will ever know what we do here. Put these two facts together, German, and draw your own conclusions before you take another step in my direction." The man halted and his club hand dropped to his side. "Come," he begged in what he intended as a conciliatory tone. "Let us be friends, Lady Greystoke. We can be of great assistance to each other, and I promise not to harm you." "Remember Liege and Louvain," she reminded him with a sneer. "I am going now. Be sure that you do not follow me. As far as you can walk in a day from this spot in any direction, you may consider the limits of my domain. If ever again I see you within these limits, I shall kill you." There could be no question that she meant what she said, and the man seemed convinced, for he but stood sullenly eyeing her as she backed from sight beyond a turn in the game trail that crossed the ford where they had met and disappeared in the forest. Chapter 20. Silently in the night. In Allure, the fortunes of the city had been tossed from hand to hand. The party of Caotan's loyal warriors that Tarzan had led to the rendezvous at the entrance to the secret passage below the palace gates had met with disaster. Their first rush had been met with soft words from the priests. They had been exhorted to defend the faith of their fathers from blasphemers. Jadon was painted to them as a defiler of temples, and the wrath of Jad Ben Otho was prophesied for those who embraced his cause. The priests insisted that Loudon's only wish was to prevent the seizure of the throne by Jadon until a new king could be chosen according to the laws of the Hodon. The result was that many of the palace warriors joined their fellows of the city, and when the priests saw that those whom they could influence outnumbered those who remained loyal to the palace, they caused the former to fall upon the latter, with the result that many were killed, and only a handful succeeded in reaching the safety of the palace gates, which they quickly barred. The priests led their own forces through the secret passageway into the temple, while some of the loyal ones sought out Jadon and told him all that had happened. The fight in the banquet hall had spread over a considerable portion of the palace grounds and had at last resulted in the temporary defeat of those who had opposed Jadon. This force, counselled by under priests sent for the purpose by Loudon, had withdrawn within the temple grounds, so that now the issue was plainly marked as between Jadon on the one side and Loudon on the other. The former had been told of all that had occurred in the apartments of Oloae, to whose safety he had attended at the first opportunity, and he had also learned of Tarzan's part in leading his men to the gathering of Loudon's warriors. These things had naturally increased the old warrior's former inclinations of friendliness toward the ape-man, and now he regretted that the other had departed from the city. The testimony of Oloae and Panatli was such as to strengthen whatever belief in the godliness of the stranger Jadon and others of the warriors had previously entertained. until presently there appeared a strong tendency upon the part of this palace faction to make the Dor Olotho an issue of their original quarrel with Ludon. Whether this occurred as the natural sequence to repeated narrations of the ape-man's exploits, which lost nothing by repetition, in conjunction with Ludon's enmity toward him, or whether it was the shrewd design of some wily old warrior such as Jadon, who realized the value of adding a religious cause to their temporal one, it were difficult to determine, but the fact remained that Jadon's followers developed bitter hatred for the followers of Ludon because of the high priest's antagonism to Tarzan. Unfortunately, however, Tarzan was not there to inspire the followers of Jadon with the holy zeal that might have quickly settled the dispute in the old chieftain's favor. Instead, he was miles away, and because their repeated prayers for his presence were unanswered, the weaker spirits among them commenced to suspect that their cause did not have divine favor. There was also another and a potent cause for defection from the ranks of Jadon. It emanated from the city where the friends and relatives of the palace warriors, who were largely also the friends and relatives of Ludon's forces, found the means, urged on by the priesthood, to circulate throughout the palace pernicious propaganda aimed at Jadon's cause. The result was that Ludon's power increased while that of Jadon waned. Then followed a sortie from the temple which resulted in the defeat of the palace forces, and though they were able to withdraw in decent order withdraw they did, leaving the palace to Ludon, who was now virtually ruler of Palildon. Jadon, taking with him the princess, her women, and their slaves, including Panat Lee, as well as the women and children of his faithful followers, retreated not only from the palace but from the city of Allur as well, and fell back upon his own city of Jalur. Here he remained, recruiting his forces from the surrounding villages of the north which, being far removed from the influence of the priesthood of Allur, were enthusiastic partisans in any cause that the old chieftain espoused, since for years he had been revered as their friend and protector. And while these events were transpiring in the north, Tarzan Jadguru lay in the lion pit at Tulur, while messengers passed back and forth between Mosar and Ludon, as the two dickered for the throne of Palildon. Mosar was cunning enough to guess that should an open breach occur between himself and the high priest, he might use his prisoner to his own advantage. For he had heard whisperings among even his own people that suggested that there were those who were more than a trifle inclined to belief in the divinity of the stranger and that he might indeed be the Dor Olotho. Ludon wanted Tarzan himself. He wanted to sacrifice him upon the eastern altar with his own hands before a multitude of people, since he was not without evidence that his own standing and authority had been lessened by the claims of the bold and heroic figure of the stranger. The method that the high priest of Tulur had employed to trap Tarzan had left the ape-man in possession of his weapons, though there seemed little likelihood of their being of any service to him. He also had his pouch, in which were the various odds and ends which are the natural accumulation of all receptacles from a gold mesh bag to an attic. There were bits of obsidian and choice feathers for arrows, some pieces of flint and a couple of steel, an old knife, a heavy bone needle, and strips of dried gut. Nothing very useful to you or me, perhaps, but nothing useless to the savage life of the ape-man. When Tarzan realized the trick that had been so neatly played upon him, he had awaited expectantly the coming of the lion, for though the scent of Jah was old, he was sure that sooner or later they would let one of the beasts in upon him. His first consideration was a thorough exploration of his prison. He had noticed the hide-covered windows, and these he immediately uncovered, letting in the light, and revealing the fact that though the chamber was far below the level of the temple courts, it was yet many feet above the base of the hill from which the temple was hewn. The windows were so closely barred that he could not see over the edge of the thick wall in which they were cut to determine what lay close in below him. At a little distance were the blue waters of Jad in Lul, and beyond, the Vajra-clad farther shore, and beyond that the mountains. It was a beautiful picture upon which he looked, a picture of peace and harmony and quiet, nor anywhere a slightest suggestion of the savage men and beasts that claimed this lovely landscape as their own. What a paradise! And some day civilized man would come and spoil it. Ruthless axes would raise that age-old wood black, sticky smoke would rise from ugly chimneys against that azure sky, grimy little boats with wheels behind or upon either side would churn the mud from the bottom of Jad in Lul, turning its blue waters to a dirty brown. Hideous piers would project into the lake from squalid buildings of corrugated iron, doubtless, for of such are the pioneer cities of the world. But would civilized man come? Tarzan hoped not. For countless generations civilization had ramped about the globe. It had dispatched its emissaries to the North Pole and the South. It had circled Palildon once, perhaps many times, but it had never touched her. God grant that it never would. Perhaps he was saving this little spot to be always just as he had made it, for the scratching of the Hodan and the Wasdan upon his rocks had not altered the fair face of nature. Through the windows came sufficient light to reveal the whole interior to Tarzan. The room was fairly large, and there was a door at each end, a large door for men and a smaller one for lions. Both were closed with heavy masses of stone that had been lowered in grooves running to the floor. The two windows were small and closely barred with the first iron that Tarzan had seen in Pal Luldan. The bars were let into holes in the casing, and the holes so strongly and neatly contrived that escape seemed impossible. Yet within a few minutes of his incarceration, Tarzan had commenced to undertake his escape. The old knife in his pouch was brought into requisition, and slowly the ape-man began to scrape and chip away the stone from about the bars of one of the windows. It was slow work, but Tarzan had the patience of absolute health. Each day food and water were brought him and slipped quickly beneath the smaller door, which was raised just sufficiently to allow the stone receptacles to pass in. The prisoner began to believe that he was being preserved for something beside lions. However, that was immaterial. If they would but hold off for a few more days, they might select what fate they would. He would not be there when they arrived to announce it. And then one day came Pansat, Ludon's chief tool, to the city of Tulur. He came ostensibly with a fair message for Mosar from the high priest at Allur. Ludon had decided that Mosar should be king, and he invited Mosar to come at once to Allur, and then Pansat, having delivered the message, asked that he might go to the temple of Tulur and pray, and there he sought the high priest of Tulur, to whom was the true message that Ludon had sent. The two were closeted alone in a little chamber, and Pansat whispered into the ear of the high priest. "Mosar wishes to be king," he said, "and Ludon wishes to be king. Mosar wishes to retain the stranger who claims to be the Doriu Otho, and Ludon wishes to kill him, and now." He leaned even closer to the ear of the high priest of Tulur. "If you would be high priest at Allur, it is within your power." Pansat ceased speaking and waited for the other's reply. The high priest was visibly affected. To be high priest at Allur, that was almost as good as being king of all Pal Ildon, for great were the powers of him who conducted the sacrifices upon the altars of Allur. "How," whispered the high priest, "how may I become high priest at Allur?" Again Pansat leaned close. "By killing the one and bringing the other to Allur," replied he. Then he rose and departed, knowing that the other had swallowed the bait and could be depended upon to do whatever was required to win him the great prize. Nor was Pansat mistaken other than in one trivial consideration. This high priest would indeed commit murder and treason to attain the high office at Allur, but he had misunderstood which of his victims was to be killed and which to be delivered to Ludon. Pansat, knowing himself all the details of the plannings of Ludon, had made the quite natural error of assuming that the other was perfectly aware that only by publicly sacrificing the false Doriu could the high priest at Allur bolster his waning power, and that the assassination of Mosar, the pretender, would remove from Ludon's camp the only obstacle to his combining the offices of high priest and king. The high priest at Tulur thought that he had been commissioned to kill Tarzan and bring Mosar to Allur. He also thought that when he had done these things he would be made high priest at Allur, but he did not know that already the priest had been selected who was to murder him within the hour that he arrived at Allur. Nor did he know that a secret grave had been prepared for him in the floor of a subterranean chamber in the very temple he dreamed of controlling. And so when he should have been arranging the assassination of his chief, he was leading a dozen heavily bribed warriors through the dark corridors beneath the temple to slay Tarzan in the lion pit. Night had fallen. A single torch guided the footsteps of the murderers as they crept stealthily upon their evil way, for they knew that they were doing the thing that their chief did not want done, and their guilty consciences warned them to stealth. In the dark of his cell, the ape-man worked at his seemingly endless chipping and scraping. His keen ears detected the coming of footsteps along the corridor, without footsteps that approached the larger door. Always before had they come to the smaller door the footsteps of a single slave who brought his food. This time there were many more than one, and their coming at this time of night carried a sinister suggestion. Tarzan continued to work at his scraping and chipping. He heard them stop beyond the door. All was silence, broken only by the scrape, scrape, scrape of the ape-man's tireless blade. Those without heard it, and listening sought to explain it. They whispered in low tones, making their plans. Two would raise the door quickly, and the others would rush in and hurl their clubs at the prisoner. They would take no chances, for the stories that had circulated in Allur had been brought to Tulur, stories of the great strength and wonderful prowess of Tarzan Jadguru that caused the sweat to stand upon the brows of the warriors. though it was cool in the damp corridor and they were 12-1. And then the high priest gave the signal, the door shot upward, and 10 warriors leapt into the chamber with poised clubs. 3 of the heavy weapons flew across the room toward a darker shadow that lay in the shadow of the opposite wall. Then the flare of the torch in the priest's hand lighted the interior, and they saw that the thing at which they had flung their clubs was a pile of skins torn from the windows, and that except for themselves the chamber was vacant. One of them hastened to a window. All but a single bar was gone, and to this was tied one end of a braided rope fashioned from strips cut from the leather window hangings. To the ordinary dangers of Jane Clayton's existence was now added the menace of Oboogat's knowledge of her whereabouts. The lion and the panther had given her less cause for anxiety than did the return of the unscrupulous Hun, whom she had always distrusted and feared, and whose repulsiveness was now immeasurably augmented by his unkempt and filthy appearance, his strange and mirthless laughter, and his unnatural demeanor. She feared him now with a new fear, as though he had suddenly become the personification of some nameless horror. The wholesome, outdoor life that she had been leading had strengthened and rebuilt her nervous system, yet it seemed to her as she thought of him that if this man should ever touch her she should scream, and possibly even faint. Again and again during the day following their unexpected meeting the woman reproached herself for not having killed him as she would Jao or Jato or any other predatory beast that menaced her existence or her safety. There was no attempt at self-justification for these sinister reflections. They needed no justification. The standards by which the acts of such as you or I may be judged could not apply to hers. We have recourse to the protection of friends and relatives and the civil soldiery that upholds the majesty of the law, and which may be invoked to protect the righteous weak against the unrighteous strong. But Jane Clayton comprised within herself not only the righteous weak but all the various agencies for the protection of the weak. To her, then Lieutenant Erich Oboogat presented no different problem than did Ja, the lion, other than that she considered the former the more dangerous animal. And so she determined that should he ignore her warning there would be no temporizing upon the occasion of their next meeting. The same swift spear that would meet Ja's advances would meet his. That night her snug little nest perched high in the great tree seemed less the sanctuary that it had before. What might resist the sanguinary intentions of a prowling panther would prove no great barrier to man, and influenced by this thought she slept less well than before. The slightest noise that broke the monotonous hum of the nocturnal jungle startled her into alert wakefulness to lie with straining ears in an attempt to classify the origin of the disturbance, and once she was awakened thus by a sound that seemed to come from something moving in her own tree. She listened intently, scarce breathing. Yes, there it was again. A scuffing of something soft against the hard bark of the tree. The woman reached out in the darkness and grasped her spear. Now she felt a slight sagging of one of the limbs that supported her shelter, as though the thing, whatever it was slowly raising its weight to the branch. It came nearer. Now she thought that she could detect its breathing. It was at the door. She could hear it fumbling with the frail barrier. What could it be? It made no sound by which she might identify it. She raised herself upon her hands and knees and crept stealthily the little distance to the doorway, her spear clutched tightly in her hand. Whatever the thing was, it was evidently attempting to gain entrance without awakening her. It was just beyond the pitiful little contraption of slender boughs that she had bound together with grasses and called a door. Only a few inches lay between the thing and her. Rising to her knees, she reached out with her left hand and felt until she found a place where a crooked branch had left an opening a couple of inches wide near the center of the barrier. Into this she inserted the point of her spear. The thing must have heard her move within, for suddenly it abandoned its efforts for stealth and tore angrily at the obstacle. At the same moment Jane thrust her spear forward with all her strength. She felt it enter flesh. There was a scream and a curse from without, followed by the crashing of a body through limbs and foliage. Her spear was almost dragged from her grasp, but she held to it until it broke free from the thing it had pierced. It was Oboogat's. The curse had told her that. From below came no further sound. Had she then killed him? She prayed so with all her heart. She prayed it. To be freed from the menace of this loathsome creature were relief indeed. During all the balance of the night she lay there awake, listening. Below her, she imagined, she could see the dead man with his hideous face bathed in the cold light of the moon lying there upon his back, staring up at her. She prayed that Ja might come and drag it away, but all during the remainder of the night she heard never another sound above the drowsy hum of the jungle. She was glad that he was dead, but she dreaded the gruesome ordeal that awaited her on the morrow, for she must bury the thing that had been Erich Oboogat's, and live on there above the shallow grave of the man she had slain. She reproached herself for her weakness, repeating over and over that she had killed in self-defense, that her act was justified, but she was still a woman of today, and strong upon her were the iron mandates of the social order from which she had sprung, its interdictions and its superstitions. At last came the tardy dawn. Slowly the sun topped the distant mountains beyond Jad and Lul, and yet she hesitated to loosen the fastenings of her door and look out upon the thing below. But it must be done. She steeled herself and untied the rawhide thong that secured the barrier. She looked down, and only the grass and the flowers looked up at her. She came from her shelter and examined the ground upon the opposite side of the tree. There was no dead man there, nor anywhere as far as she could see. Slowly she descended, keeping a wary eye and an alert ear ready for the first intimation of danger. At the foot of the tree was a pool of blood and a little trail of crimson drops upon the grass, leading away parallel with the shore of Jad Ben Lul. Then she had not slain him. She was vaguely aware of a peculiar, double sensation of relief and regret. Now she would be always in doubt. He might return, but at least she would not have to live above his grave. She thought some of following the bloody spoor on the chance that he might have crawled away to die later, but she gave up the idea for fear that she might find him dead nearby, or worse yet, badly wounded. What then could she do? She could not finish him with her spear, no, she knew that she could not do that, nor could she bring him back and nurse him, nor could she leave him there to die of hunger or of thirst, or to become the prey of some prowling beast. It were better then not to search for him for fear that she might find him. That day was one of nervous starting to every sudden sound. The day before she would have said that her nerves were of iron, but not today. She knew now the shock that she had suffered, and that this was the reaction. Tomorrow it might be different, but something told her that never again would her little shelter and the patch of forest and jungle that she called her own be the same. There would hang over them always the menace of this man. No longer would she pass restful nights of deep slumber. The peace of her little world was shattered forever. That night she made her door, doubly secure with additional thongs of rawhide cut from the pelt of the buck she had slain the day that she met Obergatz. She was very tired, for she had lost much sleep the night before, but for a long time she lay with wide open eyes, staring into the darkness. What saw she there? Visions that brought tears to those brave and beautiful eyes, visions of a rambling bungalow that had been home to her and that was no more, destroyed by the same cruel force that haunted her even now in this remote, uncharted corner of the earth. Visions of a strong man whose protecting arm would never press her close again. Visions of a tall, straight son who looked at her adoringly out of brave, smiling eyes that were like his father's. Always the vision of the crude, simple bungalow rather than of the stately halls that had been as much a part of her life as the other. But he had loved the bungalow and the broad, free acres best, and so she had come to love them best too. At last she slept, the sleep of utter exhaustion. How long it lasted she did not know, but suddenly she was wide awake, and once again she heard the scuffing of a body against the bark of her tree, and again the limb bent to a heavy weight. He had returned. She went cold, trembling as with ague. Was it he, or, oh God, had she killed him then, and was this? She tried to drive the horrid thought from her mind, for this way she knew lay madness. And once again she crept to the door, for the thing was outside just as it had been last night. Her hands trembled as she placed the point of her weapon to the opening. She wondered if it would scream as it fell,